Member for Skeena, Bulkley Valley.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. And at the commencement, I'm happy to be splitting my time with the member from Cowichan, Malahat, Langford. I'm searching for the right word, Mr. Speaker. I typically or traditionally say it is an honor or a pleasure to rise today, yet in my few years here in Parliament, the number of times I and others have stood in this place demanding, pleading, insisting on change for First Nations children has become so repetitive as government after government finds another reason to fail the most vulnerable in our society. And this is for folks watching, this is an so-called opposition day in which the opposition puts forward a motion that we see as a priority. And there were many things we as a New Democrat caucus wanted to put forward today. There's oil, diesel spilling over the coast in British Columbia. Where's the Liberal protection plan for our coast? There's a climate change crisis facing the world and big Liberal promises, yet no plan. And the poverty and the inequality going on in our economy with what is performing in a very weak level, manufacturing jobs continuing to be shed. These are all important priorities for Canadians. Yet when you hold up this particular case, when you look at the Human Rights Tribunal decision of earlier this year, is there anything more stark? Is there anything more defining as a moral imperative for a government than when the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal declares definitively that the federal government is prejudiced and running a discriminatory program, a racialized program against the interests of a particular group. And that in this case, that group is First Nations children. I'm trying to remember if it was another distinct group in Canada. I'm trying to imagine if it was another ethnically decided upon group in Canada. The Human Rights Tribunal came forward and said, the federal government is consistently enacting policy that is discriminatory, that is racist towards that group of Canadians. If it would take just one report, and yet we've had dozens of inquiries, we've had dozens of investigations and dozens of Human Rights Tribunal reports into the federal government's discriminatory, race-based actions against the interests of First Nations children and families. And we have this new government, just now a year old. And you'd say, well, for that first year, there's lots of priorities and lots of things to figure out as a government. So how do they treat those different priorities? Because I just heard the Liberals say this is a crisis. This is a crisis for the Liberal government. It's a crisis for the Canadian. So let's compare how the rate of activity. That when they had a decision over a mega dam project in northeastern British Columbia that went against First Nations interests, did the Liberal government hire an envoy to go out and consult and understand the different interests and values? No. They just fired up the bulldozer, and 24 hours later they approved one of the most, actually the most damaging project to the environment in Canadian history. No special envoy, no consultation tour. When they went forward and had to approve a liquefied natural gas plant on the north coast in my riding that again had specific, and today a lawsuit in court against First Nations rights and title, did the Liberals say, well, we need to make sure that everybody's on side and we actually understand the science? No, they said, let's fire it up and get that done too. And yet when it comes to this, that for months and months and years and decades, we've known that there is a shortfall of funding for First Nations kids, and that shortfall causes real harm and in some cases death to First Nations kids. After the apology that took place on the floor of the House of Commons, which all parties agreed to, after the many betrayals, and I use that word very importantly, Mr. Speaker, and very specifically, because a betrayal is when a promise has been made and hope has been offered, and then the opposite comes forward. And when First Nations leaders talk about the betrayal of the federal government, they mean it. And it's based on something substantive and important and real. When it comes to dealing with this crisis, the Liberal response was to hire an envoy who just a few minutes ago said the NDP's idea and Cindy Blackstock's solution to this is to throw, and I'm quoting here, to throw money around like confetti. When it was the Human Rights Tribunal and Cindy Blackstock, who is renowned throughout this country in fighting for the welfare of First Nations children, that has told us definitively that the shortfall is $155 million to First Nations kids. Instead, what's this government's response? To congratulate themselves, to say we're doing more than can even be expected. Well, who are you going to believe? Who are you going to believe? You're going to believe Cindy Blackstock, Or are you going to believe this Prime Minister who got a tattoo on his arm to signify how important First Nations relations were, which, by the way, he technically stole from the Haida, who are not too pleased about that right now. But the notion that this Prime Minister has wrapped himself, oh, no, it's true. To help my Liberal friends out here, the Prime Minister of the country had a tattoo put on his arm, which he got off the internet, which is nice, except that in the Haida tradition, that's theft. Because he took a sacred Haida design and put it on his body, which the Haida came to and said, okay, there is an honor in this, that the Prime Minister, a high profile and a significant person, has chosen to have Haida ink on his body. The Haida interpret that as meaning a sacred connection, actually, a very important connection. And I've had the privilege of years of spending time with that incredible First Nation. And the Haida are out today, and the artist who actually rendered that beautiful piece, saying they feel betrayed by this Prime Minister and no longer feel that him walking day to day as he does around this place and around the world, wearing that significant piece of Haida art is no longer an actual an honoring of the Haida people. You've got to give pause on this, Mr. Speaker. There's day-to-day moments that happen in politics. There's things that come and go and tweets and hassles, and yet there's something deeper and more sacred that we're talking about here today. I've spoken with the various First Nations agencies in my riding, the Gitxsan, the Wet'suwet'en, the Carrier-Sekani, who are doing, despite the lack of resources, incredible work with First Nations families. Despite long odds, despite almost impossible situations, they are finding ways to connect their young people to culture. I was in the far north of my riding, along the Yukon border, and the First Nations there, the Taku River Tlingit, and others have found, the Tahltan, have found ways, despite the racist policies of federal and provincial governments, found ways to have their children no longer being taken into care by outside agencies, have found ways to meet the challenges of dependency and the theft of land and the poverty that comes with that, to restore tradition, to restore culture and language and a sense of self, despite all of these things. So when we stand in the House of Commons today and we hear the government's response, the Liberals say, we're different, and pull a muscle patting themselves on the back for the appointment of a special envoy, that more consultations are the trick after so many years of betrayal, so many years of conclusive reports, after the Human Rights Tribunal has come down, and that's what this motion from the NDP calls for, is simply respect the Human Rights Tribunal, respect Jordan's principle, which this House passed almost a decade ago. And yet when we ask for that to actually come into force, to be beyond just a motion in the House, when we say in this vote, in this Parliament, Canada's Parliament, we're going to do more than mouth the words about respect for First Nations, more than mouth the words about crisis in First Nations communities and that the crisis that children are facing, which are real and horrifying. Rather than just mouth those words, we thought, well, here's a good idea. Let's tell the truth and shame the devil and actually put those words into action. And what we hear from Liberals today is, well, we can't vote for this. We can't implement things that we voted for in the past, because why would we want to do that? That First Nations should simply trust us because we're Liberals and we're not Stephen Harper. That's not good enough, my friends. Speeches are not good enough from this government. Photos are not good enough. Showing up at ceremonies is not good enough. A tattoo is not good enough. What's good enough is actually doing what the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal has ordered this government to do in an unprecedented declaration of January of 2016. I don't understand, for the life of me, how the Liberals can say to First Nations leaders, to First Nations families, to First Nations kids, we care. Yet stand in this House on a day like today, when we have in front of us an opportunity to bring into action, to make real that promise, to make real that hope, that the Liberals stand and say it's good enough, a special envoy should satisfy. I don't know what planet Liberals are occupying right now. That if they wish to, and this is a sincere offer, visit with me or on their own, will facilitate and make it happen. My riding in northern British Columbia, if they want to meet the families struggling with these issues, if they want to meet the frontline workers who are day to day making solutions, making a better world possible with limited and almost no funds in some cases, then they're welcome. we humbly offer up the many good examples happening in northern British Columbia, despite the racist policies, despite the discrimination, and despite the continual lack of funding. And no more cynical, we're funding it and we're going to fund it in the 5th year of our government. First Nations got wise to this a long time ago, and Liberals promised to do different. And yet when you look at their funding promises, where does the majority of the funding land after the next election? Really? That's the best you've got? First Nations deserve more. First Nations will get more. Let's pass this motion. Let's do the right thing. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs.
Speaker, and I listened very attentively to the member's comments. First of all, I want to say is we have accepted the rulings of the tribunal. We have started the implementations of the rulings by the tribunal. We have accepted the definition of Jordan's principle, and we certainly did not need a motion from the NDP for the government opposite here to start doing what was urgent and what was necessary. Mr. Speaker, the problem that I have with what the NDP is pushing here today in the House of Commons is that they don't believe that a renewed relationship with Indigenous people in this country should be shaped by Indigenous people. They believe, Mr. Speaker, that the government should have a top-down approach and that they have the best ideas for Indigenous Canada. Well, Mr. Speaker, it is that kind of thinking that have gotten us to where we are today. And what I would remind the member, Mr. Speaker, and ask him why he does not agree with the tribunal ruling that the Government of Canada should fund children on First Nations based on need and not based on a number that the NDP pulls out of the air.
The honourable member for Skeena-Bulkley Valley.
Well, 2 words from my friend, Muskrat Falls. How's that going for top-down government handling of an issue? How is it that the government now says, we agree with everything in this, but we won't vote for it? We agree with everything in it, but we won't vote for it. Where do you think these ideas came from? First Nations people who had to go to court, had to take the previous federal government to court to get resolution over this at the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. That's where this came from the Assembly of First Nations. What First Nations is she talking about? You want to work with First Nations? Vote for the motion. Where did this idea come from? First Nations. Who would this help? First Nations. What part of this sentence doesn't the minister's assistant understand that comes from the Prime Minister's own mandate letter to all cabinet ministers? No relationship is more important to me and to Canada than the one with Indigenous peoples. Oh yeah? Walk the talk. Vote for the motion.